Enrollments at university since 1994 have doubled. Okay, so we've got a doubling of student intake. HESA, which is the Higher Education South Africa body for vice-chancellors, presented to the Portfolio Committee on Higher Education and Training in March, and their comment was that notwithstanding the huge uptick in enrollments, the funding from a budgetary perspective, whether you look at it relative to CPI, whether you look at it relative to a per student cost per head, whether you look at it relative to percentage of the budget within the Treasury allocation, has not kept pace in real terms or as a percentage of GDP over that period. Okay? The last 10 years have seen little investment in student accommodation. This is per the vice-chancellors, and the reason's obvious. Look at the uptake in enrollments. They've doubled. So a lot of the money's had to go towards teaching. The ministerial report identifies a backlog in 2010 of 200,000 beds. There are currently, Brenda, you said 107,000, more or less. So that is a sort of a threefold increase that you're wanting to achieve in terms of your numbers at that point, and enrollments of about 950,000. The refurbishment component of 4.4 billion is about another 35,000 beds if you use an average of 125,000 a bed. If you look at the National Development Plan, which we haven't got to, for 2030, which is just 15 years away, okay, it's a blink. From a policy perspective, it's a blink. The kind of access and participation that is planned for there is an increase from, let's call it 900-odd thousand students to 1.6 million. That's about a 78% increase. And if you want a density of beds to the 1.6 versus what we would like to have, which includes the rollout of the backlog identified by the ministerial report, you're looking at almost double the 200,000 backlog. So we're not talking about 200. We're probably talking about 400,000 beds, excluding the fact that we've got poor conditions in many of those dorms because of the 4.4 billion that Brenda referred to.
From our side, I mean, as DBSA's core business, we do fund universities. We do a lot of on-balance sheet funding. The fact is that the challenge that the department has here is far bigger than what on-balance sheet funding can accommodate. I'd just like to take a step back and say, let's assume the vision is that we have to have quality education. Now on that, the department sets the guidelines, universities implement, so tick boxes there. We need it effectively delivered. On that, there's room to bring in private sector, purely given the scale of the rollout that's required, the additional operational functions that need to happen at all these extra pieces of accommodation, etc. So that you need to bring in. But then we get to fundable transactions and we get to affordable transactions. Firstly, on the fundable side, our view, and this has been through various interactions with department, with Treasury, our view is that each university has a certain microcosm of students. It will always have a certain volume of students. The challenge is to move those students into appropriate accommodation, where a lot of it is not being catered for at the moment. So you have a volume you can look at from a funding perspective. The only thing we need, and this is, this doesn't happen overnight, it's a long-term engagement, but the thing from a funding side that's needed is a relative certainty of money matching with the number of students. So now Treasury has constraints. The student housing program will never be a REAP kind of power producer program for the simple reason that their Treasury actively backed Eskom and said, I'm the market maker, I will make sure the payments get made. To put that additional burden on government in terms of student housing, if you're talking 109 billion, it becomes too substantive. So we have to find more creative ways of looking at it. From our perspective, if we have reasonable certainty within a rolling medium-term expenditure framework, that where budgets are available, they will be allocated appropriately, it makes it an acceptable risk over a longer-term view. What really drives the student accommodation challenge for me is the affordable component. To make this affordable, we need very long tenor financing. What needs to happen with the housing, with the accommodation, is that the unitary cost per year per student needs to be kept as low as possible. The one way of doing that is throwing much more debt at it over a much longer window, which brings down that unitary cost. Yes, the thing's costing you more because you're paying a bank the interest rate or whoever's providing the debt, but it brings down the unitary cost. The other side of that affordability is, and it goes outside the conventional approach to student housing, but the other approach to it is to say, how else can we bring down those unitary costs? If we're looking at newer residences, shouldn't we think maybe different about infrastructure? If you're talking about sewer lines, water lines, all those kind of things, let's not think about it as something that we want to build for the next 20, 30 years, but maybe look at a more lower cost, replaceable kind of infrastructure. Think about water piping, using 20, 30 millimeter pipes just to get the right amount of water that's needed for use, but you know you're going to have to replace it in 7 years, but it brings down your unitary cost.